And I want us to jump right in to talk to Kathleen and Usha about what are the signs and symptoms of post-migration distress. I think Usha suggested some of them, but particularly, Usha, you spoke about gender roles and different kinds of things, and I imagine that different cultures or different places of origin might present certain symptoms differently, right?
Yes, sure. So some symptoms might be quite direct and verbal in nature, and others can be more subtle. Some people, particularly, we find that with female clients, and particularly from cultures where it is more acceptable to express psychological distress through somatic symptoms, so through the body in a sense. The person might be experiencing headaches, might have gastrointestinal issues, be in some kind of bodily pain, but oftentimes for those individuals, that's typically how they get help or are able to seek help, by seeking help from a primary care physician, perhaps a family physician, who then might notice that actually there's not a physical basis to what's happening, what the person's experiencing, but rather that they seek help for mental health issues.
Kathleen, you want to add that?
Yes, thank you. In addition to everything Usha has said, something that we see here a lot is grief and loss. Maybe not of death, but loss of homeland, loss of home in general, loss of connection with family members, and loss of self-efficacy in a lot of ways, especially if someone is not able to continue in their professional role as they were in their home country. We see that that really has an impact on somebody's sense of self, sense of identity, and processing that through the acculturation process has a big impact.
And I imagine that struggling to create an identity for yourself and embrace this as a new homeland, and then being told, oh, this is not your new homeland. I mean, that as well comes into play. And I want to get Westy now to, this is a situation, what can we do? You know, everyday interactions, what can we do? Some of the basic things to make immigrants feel safer.
Well, we're talking about something so complex that I really appreciate the variety of voices. But I think we begin by asking, are we helping the immigrant community itself to be protective? And one of the things that I think everyone should do is have a real clear sense about their legal status. It's amazing how many people are eligible for citizenship who haven't stopped to realize that or take steps. We should be encouraging everyone to be very clear about all their legal options. Sarang detailed those, but it takes a little extra analysis for most people to come to terms with what their real situation is and if there is any option that they have. Second area that we haven't talked about, but I think is really important in families, is to think of Plan B. There is a real sense of preparedness that's necessary when you're living in an anxious state. What's going to happen if? And I think when people take the time to develop a plan for their family, should something dire happen, that they know that things will be okay, there is a certain reassurance in that and a certain clarity that is helpful to reducing anxiety. The Catholic Immigrant Integration Clinic, folks have a whole kit available on developing Plan B, so I'd encourage people to take a look at that and put that to work in their lives as something to help them have organized materials. And the third thing to just quickly lift up in brevity of time is family discipline around this subject. You know, children receive, they're receivers, and family anxiety is something that can become compounded. And one of the questions is, what's your dinner table like? What's your family conversation like? How are you responding to the news? There's a real value in asking families to stop and think and be reflective of how we build hope and positive self-esteem and self-worth, and not to create an environment where anxiety is perpetuated and enlarged, so that children have at least a fighting chance of being focused and attentive to the business of growing up.
And Eileen, I know that you're familiar with a lot of these family issues, and I wanted to find out about much of what happens in the classroom with children today is out of public view, but we know that anti-immigrant sentiment has permeated America's classrooms. What can teachers do to create safer classrooms?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that every single educator I've talked to in any state, anywhere, tells me they are seeing the impact of the trauma on immigrant children. And it's not just necessarily the children who may have immigrant parents, but the entire classroom, the entire school community. And it's important for teachers to see this as not a political issue, because there are people in schools where perhaps a principal is not necessarily supportive of overall immigrant policy, let's put it that way. But you can view this as supporting our students. We cannot educate students unless they feel safe and they feel connected. So the very first thing that teachers can do and principals and others can do is provide that feeling of safety, provide that feeling of security to a child. It is a major thing for a family to know that every day there is a place their child can go where the child will be valued, where the child will feel welcome, where the child will feel safe, and also to be an empathetic ear for the family. You don't want to pry. It's not the right of a teacher to ask questions like that, but to be there if the family member wants to share, and to create a relationship where the family member feels comfortable talking with you.
And moving toward a more clinical setting, we're talking about building that relationship and I guess fostering an atmosphere of trust. In more clinical settings, Kathleen and Usha, how do you build that trust with immigrant clients in this particular climate, getting them to open up about their current stress? And then once that relationship has been built, what evidence-based therapeutic techniques can they employ to mitigate the additional stresses they're experiencing?
Okay, I'll go ahead and take that. Thank you. Well, working from a strength-based perspective is something that I personally and many of my colleagues have found to be a really helpful approach, which means looking at the person you're working with, looking at someone through the lens of what are their strengths. They have a ton of resiliency already built in. If they have made it here, they have experienced whatever they experienced on the way over, are going through the acculturation process. Building on those strengths is really key, and providing options so that when somebody feels disempowered in terms of the political landscape, the immigration process, facing racism, discrimination, what have you, being able to provide options and choices so that that individual or that family can feel a sense of autonomy and a sense of control over what they do have control over is a really useful tool.
And I could just add to what Caitlin, you've already said, in that there's a way in which I think it's really important, as you would with other survivors of different types of trauma, that that it's important to recognize that this is an unsafe environment. I mean, I think there, to sort of act as though that, trying to reassure with good intentions, but not really recognizing the reality that the reality that we are indeed in an unsafe, unprotected type of space is an important part of clinical work. And I absolutely agree that in addition to that, we have to think about resiliency and think about, well, and as Westy brought up, what's a real practical kind of plan, that will try to at least ensure your safety in the moment, or in the near future, and take this as a day by day, week by week kind of process. But I think it's very important for clinicians to acknowledge and recognize the realities of racism, the realities of xenophobia, and that's what really underlies these policies as well. So I think, really bringing, really sort of recognizing the reality of that is very critical in clinical practice.
Denzil, could I build on some of that for what goes on in the classroom? I think absolutely what you just said, we can't just reassure a child everything's going to be okay. And I know that there are teachers that want to say, don't worry, you'll be fine. We can't do that because we can't guarantee that. But what we can do is connect families to resources, such as social workers or immigrant organizations that can come into the school, that can do immigrant right workshops, so that we provide the support in that way. And the idea of supporting families who, in their doing a family plan, as Westy was talking about. It's critical, but I think it's also important for teachers, again, who are trained as educators and are going into a little bit different territory, but may have this relationship that's so valuable, to understand the impact, the gut level impact of making a family plan to leave the country. Are your children going to come with you? All your closest relatives may be in the same situation as you are. If your children are citizens and they want to stay, who are you going to leave them with? And what's the impact on that family? So these are really emotional decisions that we all need to be aware of as we talk and become allies of immigrant families.
And I just wanted to add in something that has been really important as all these uncertainties come up, is the fact that, you know, it's not a simple process of someone goes through the traumatic experience of coming here and acculturating, and then, you know, they just get better and better and more stable and happier and healthier. With all of this uncertainty, with both true and untrue information going around, with laws changing, migration being affected in that way, we're seeing a need for continuity of care, right? So it's not just when someone comes, they need extra support. It's throughout the process of maybe their immigration process or reunifying the family, or, you know, years and years potentially of creating spaces where people can receive ongoing support, because it's not a linear process. There's lots of ups and downs depending on that individual or the family's personal experience and the climate and what's happening here.
And I would like to encourage our panelists, actually, if you are thinking of some of those resources or organizations that can help, you can feel free to type it in the chat box for our attendees. And those are some very, very good things to consider when dealing one-on-one with these people and with these communities, given the situation. And we're talking a lot about safety. And I feel as though in this conversation, we need to bring up law enforcement. Many of us in this webinar have relationships with local police. But how do we get law enforcement to be more culturally competent and educated about immigrant concerns to create a safer, more trusting community in this atmosphere of fear? I mean, do we have any suggestions? Probably Eileen or Westy or Kaplan?
Well, I appreciate the National Immigration Forum and their Bible Badges and Business has really reached out and discovered that most of our urban police forces do understand the need for local policing and to develop trust. So we do need to bring police into our immigrant life, into our schools and neighborhoods and churches where immigrants are, to build relationships, to build some trust, and to be able to have some rapport, and also to affect backwards into their system some positive reflection of concern and engagement. But I don't want to dismiss the fact that there's a 43% increase by ICE of people being put into detention. This is really an egregious time in which we live, and the sense of the loss of rights is very significant. I think that we do need, through our schools and our churches and other places, very overt conversation that the teenager who thought that they could be pretty casual and outside the family is now putting their family at risk. And it becomes of paramount importance that there be some new overt conversation about what it means to be law-abiding. This is not because we're suddenly, going hard right and saying, it's got to be this way or the highway. It's because we can't protect people who expose themselves to the law enforcement community in its, with all of its ramifications right now. Anybody who shows up is likely to suffer consequences much greater today than they might have in the past. And I want to just put a note on a very different side of this conversation beyond policing. We, the allies and the professional community, can't meet all the needs of 11 million people who are living out of status. One of the things that's really important for us is to think in terms of the bridging and bonding that's going on through faith communities, through our schools, in our mutual assistance associations, where people can find each other and build that network of solidarity and support, to get right information into those places, and to have people who stand in such a way with each other that their anxiety level goes down and their information level goes up. This is a huge step. And unfortunately, one of the signs of anxiety is people retreat. And there's a huge number of folks who are dealing with, what we figure from our studies, about 10% of folks with PTSD or anxiety in the refugee and immigrant community. So if we have 10% of that population with severe depression, anxiety, they're going to be retreating in the very time when they need not to be. We need to be proactive in terms of helping to keep people engaged and in community during these very difficult political times.
I think it's also important to note that there are different rules that apply to ICE agents and local community police. And certainly not all local community police are culturally sensitive, but some are. And I know in communities near me, there's been an uproar because ICE agents wore police jackets and the community members actually trusted the police. So I think we do have to just educate families about their rights. Many times, many schools have stepped in to be that resource for families. The AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, has a very active program supporting immigrant students and families. And on their website, I'll try to get a link to it, there are resources where you can download family rights that you can hand to the families in the community to just make them aware of what their rights are. And I think, as has been said by others, that's a really important point right now. And schools can be that resource. That's one of the things teachers can do, is be a resource of accurate information about what families' rights are. Connect them to pro bono attorneys. Don't provide legal advice yourself, but connect them to attorneys and legal rights organizations.
I just wanted to jump in to say something that we do that's been effective in this area is invite police officers, local police officers, to come and talk with our clients so that there's an actual dialogue, along with providing information that's accurate, a dialogue so that both parties can learn from each other and gain some, not just knowledge, but comfort in communication, so that that can break down some of the barriers.
And I would just say, from a previous webinar we did on immigration safety and security, looking at links with terrorism or with crime, police chiefs did mention things like storytelling, encouraging storytelling of who these immigrants are, giving their stories, letting people learn more about them, including people on the police force. And I have noticed some police forces police departments that would create fact sheets about countries like Eritrea. This is what language they speak. This is what they look like, so that their police force gets to know a little bit about who these newcomers are. And I thought that was quite remarkable. And before I move on to attendee questions, I just want to ask Dr. Tummala-Narra one little question about, in the past year, have you seen in your clients changes in what they view as the American dream or their dreams for their own future?
Absolutely. I think that there's a lot of questioning of whether or not, for what their future would look like, and their sense of belonging, people's sense of wondering of whether or not the progress that seemingly has been made over the last decade when it comes to race and racial dynamics in the US has now spun out of control and sort of regressed to another time. And so I do think there's a deep level of anxiety about whether or not people want to stay in the United States voluntarily. If it doesn't mean that going back to a country of origin would mean persecution or some other kind of trauma. But there's a lot of questioning of that. And this, I would say, is true for second generation people as well, that there's a lot of disillusionment that my clients certainly experience in terms of being in this country at this moment.
So we have several questions from attendees, and I want to get to them right now. Kathleen, you were talking earlier about how do you approach these therapeutic techniques in a clinical setting. Any other specific examples of providing options? Someone said that she feels like, especially undocumented families, probably don't have many options.
Right. Well, there's a lot of things that we can look at and say, we can say what we don't have options in, and that can feel really defeating. But looking at anything, no matter how small it is, within your interaction, what kind of options are you providing? It could be something as simple as, you know, where do you want to sit in the room? What time do you want to meet? Things that are very basic on that level, but also what kind of services do you want to receive? What are your priorities? What are your goals? Really allowing for, you know, what kind of help do you want to receive? What kind of community connections can I help you connect with? How can I help you build community? It can be very personal in terms of how do you control your breath, right? When you feel like nothing else is under your control, how do you control your breath? So some very basic things, and then building from there.
And maybe for Eileen and for Usha, what safe counseling resources can a school direct families to when they report their difficulties to them?
You know, my experience is largely in the classroom, and most of the schools that I've been working with have a social worker, so I'm not the best person on the resources for social workers themselves, but I do want to say that teachers play a really valuable role. They are the ones that see the children every single day. They are the ones that the parents have the closest connection to. And I know one of the questioners raised the issue of how do you help students, how do you help families where mental health might be a stigma? And I've actually written about that. And one of the ways to support families that way is through the teacher. A teacher or a principal that the family already has a relationship with may be able to help break down that stigma and connect them to the resources at the school or in the community. So I think that to me is the role that teachers play. It's that vital, empathetic connection to connect families to resources.
I can add that I think that schools, and maybe even more broadly in mental health settings as well, it's not to assume that every mental health setting is equipped or trained in helping immigrant communities. And I think there's a way in which both schools and different clinics in every community really need to develop what's available to their particular communities that they're serving and working with. And I do think it's the responsibility of people who are in charge of those clinics or in charge of those schools to develop that as a resource for referring people. Because, you know, for example, knowing where to refer somebody for legal resources versus counseling and psychotherapy resources, things like that, and economically accessible to those individuals and families. This is really critical. And sometimes it's, you know, I agree with everybody in terms of the importance of helping immigrants and immigrant families to access resources. In addition to that, I like this concept that was brought up around just kind of breathing, you know, because there is a way in which at this moment when there is active trauma and it's ongoing, that sometimes a client just wants a witness to hear their story. They want the ability for us as professionals to be able to sit down and witness and bear with them what it is that they're experiencing. And this is really critical and often gets missed as though, you know, that's a secondary issue, but often it isn't. It's really, it works hand in hand. And what you're saying, Eileen, also about teachers being able to sort of hold this with their kids, you know, in the classroom. I think that cuts across clinical and educational settings. The importance of that cannot be overstated.
I think since most foreign-born find their first contact to be either clergy, an educator, or a social worker, one of the questions is, are we training these leaders to be cultural brokers and navigators? And I think that it sounds good to refer people to a mental health center, but the question is who's going to do that job? And someone has got to take on the responsibility. I think inside of almost every school, the school adjustment counselor is just not focused in that direction. That's not what they've been trained to do or what they think their job is. And one of our challenges is to really ask clergy to stop and to do some learning, to get some continuing education, to ask that not only of police, but also to ask it repeatedly of almost every provider community, so that people stop to reassess how accessible they are, to whom they're accessible, and what they're doing to get rid of the barriers. It's a profound gift to have a social worker working inside of a school whose job is community resources and to link people back out. I think one of the things that we need a lot more of are individuals who are identified as the advocate, as the negotiator, as the cultural broker, because when somebody can find the navigator, the resources are there in most communities. They just aren't known.
I think that's a really important point, and there's a recommendation out there that every school have an educator, if not the social worker, dedicated to be the person who, when someone comes in with an issue, that person knows what the resources are. And you have a parent who is bilingual or trilingual, what is knowledgeable in the languages of the community, that can be the connection to the resources. I think it's important for everybody to stand up as allies taking that role.
And adding to that, I think that working on multidisciplinary teams and forming partnerships is really crucial. You know, we as mental health professionals here, we work with the lawyers and we work with the individuals that are helping with job training and job seeking. So tapping into what people are seeking and then providing that additional mental health support that somebody may not seek out by itself, but once they're dealing with the processes of survival, things that come up, we're there and we're able to respond.
And Westy, this question really is for you. In so many ways, we're asking teachers and social workers and all these other people to be advocates. But how do you boost advocates within agencies to make social work more inclusive of immigrants and refugees?
Well, it's the role of continuing education, and I appreciate how much of that I do. I'm sure Usha's doing it as well. One of the things that we have to do is really ask our professional organizations to put into our conferences, to put into our workshops, to be wherever we're going to be, opportunities for people to up their game, to become much more knowledgeable. I just did the Family Trust, Children's Trust conference last weekend, and I realized that there are hundreds of hungry social workers working with kids who really don't have a clue the difference between a refugee and an undocumented person, unaccompanied minor. And just to begin to give them the basics means that they become much better allies and much more sensitive, competent professionals who are able to enter into that family's dynamic and to do something that is meaningful and appropriate at that time, beginning with some empathy and then moving quickly past empathy into some professional guidance and direction. We can't be afraid to ask for the training that we need, and none of us are prepared for the wave of what's happened, I think, in terms of a cultural shift that's around us. I've been referring to this as a public health crisis. You know, when things are this bad in terms of the media every day and every paper you pick up and a million tweets that seem to echo and bounce off walls, it becomes something that needs to be elevated to a level that we haven't done in the immigrant community. It's one thing to be a voice for immigration reform. It's another to be a voice for immigrant protection and safety and services. And today we need both.
And I think our penultimate question is going to be someone asking about mental health strategies and wondering if, you know, in that particular person's day treatment health setting, they have decided not to ask about immigration status, or even if this person is foreign born or not. But the attendee is wondering whether this actually diminishes their ability to identify immigration trauma or current stresses. Do you all have any thoughts on that?
Don't ask, don't ask, don't ask. Maura Healey, the Attorney General, and the Attorneys General of the United States are sending out guidance to hospitals to ask them not to ask unless it's absolutely necessary, to not put it as a written record. There's no reason for people to put this in the written records. There may be a time when they're helping a family and it's appropriate to ask a question that's a leading question to understand how the status is playing into a drama or a mental health situation. But we don't need to make it part of our protocol or part of our record making because that just puts everybody under one more liability.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Westy said. Yes.
In school settings, there's something called directory information that is public information that anyone can access, including ICE. And schools now have to make a decision on what to include. I don't think anyone's ever included immigration status, but you know, there are things like addresses and who the child is living with and things that actually make the school run. And a lot of schools are now really thinking deeply about what to include in that directory information. But you can know these things in private conversations, but never ask and never violate that trust by asking.
And I think something that's important is it's very possible to provide information to people who may be seeking legal paths and legal processes without asking for information. You can provide information about, if this is your scenario, this is who you can talk to. If this sounds like you, these are your options. Directing them, of course, to lawyers for legal advice. But being able to provide information doesn't require you knowing anyone's status.
Right. And of course, the scary thing for DACA individuals is that their information is all out there. It's all public record. Their identification is all public record. That's part of what is traumatizing them.
Denzil, before we run out of time, I'm worried that we never miss the opportunity to say that there are some serious bills. There is an effort to get an act for the DACA students, young people, and I think it's critical that we who are caring about this, who know the stories, echo those stories in letters to legislators. I was talking to a Democratic legislator from Massachusetts who says, I don't get letters on this issue. Which just blows my mind that in this moment, he's not hearing from all of us. We need to speak to the issue. We are informed citizens, and the voiceless at this point need a voice if ever.
And I think we want to wrap up now with some final thoughts. I know we have a lot of other burning questions, but we will provide information, resources, and perhaps some contact information should attendees want to reach out to our wonderful experts today. I think I want to end by perhaps if you, just in 10 seconds, each of you, starting with you, Usha, if you can give our attendees your top tip that they can do right now to make the lives of the foreign-born better, what would it be?
Yeah, it would be to listen carefully what their stories are, don't assume, and bear witness to what's happening, reassure, but be realistic in terms of what you're reassuring around. Yeah.
Kathleen?
Thank you. I would say you have to work from a place of compassion and real human connection with each individual you're working with, and work collaboratively. There's all of us from all over on the panel and attendees working collaboratively, sharing information, building supportive communities and networks is really, really key in individuals and families and communities feeling supported.
And I'm with you, Caitlin. My word to my students all the time is, if you're working alone in the immigrant community, you're failed. We need to work in partnership. We need to work in alliances. We need to connect. This is creating supportive networks, a web of support, a social engagement is the best protection, defense, and also the way in which we who are providers can extend ourselves unlimitedly into the community.
And I would just add that educators have this tremendous power to be a source of strength, a source of stability, a source of comfort to a child every day. So while a family is living in chaos and not knowing what's going on from day to day, to know every day their child has a place to go where they are valued and where it's going to be just like it was yesterday. And while teachers themselves are traumatized right now in dealing with this, they need to remember their role as being that empathetic ear and the source of stability.
Thank you very much, everyone. This was a really wonderful discussion, and I'd like all of our attendees to share your thanks to our wonderful panelists, Dr. Westy Egmont, Tromiczak, Eileen Kugler, and Dr. Usha Tummala-Narra.